Hey, all you remote learners out there, how are you today? So, today we're going to be moving into chapter 17. And today and tomorrow we're going to be talking about the election of 1960 and the presidency of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. So, we're going to talk really today about his domestic policies, which he calls his new frontier. And we're going to start off by talking about the election today and really just what his programs are for America. And then tomorrow we're going to talk more so about his foreign policy and kind of his, reaction to dealing with the Cold War. And then if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about his assassination. And then next week we'll talk a little bit about his assassination as well, and kind of what the policies of President Johnson, his vice president, were once he came into office, kind of his domestic policies. And then next week we'll be focusing on the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War. And then finally, we will be done with this year. So and we'll get some of the counterculture, some of the reaction to the Vietnam War and the protests in there as well. So we're getting closer to the year coming to an end, but we still have quite a bit of content left. So make sure you're keeping up with lectures and all the notes in this unit. So on the left, you see a picture of Richard Nixon, and on the right, you see a picture of JFK. Richard Nixon was a well-known American figure by the time we get to the election of 1960 when he's running for the presidency against JFK. Richard Nixon had been a member of WAC during the 1950s, so he was helping hunt for communists out in Hollywood and really throughout America. And then he was the vice president of the United States under Eisenhower during his second term between 56 and 60. So he decides to run for the presidency himself, and it's going to be a very close race as that Republican candidate goes up against JFK, who is the Democratic candidate, who also has political experience, but doesn't quite have perhaps the standing in America that Nixon had.
The presidential candidates in 1960, Massachusetts Senator John Kennedy and Vice President Richard Nixon, were only in their mid-40s. Both were ardent Cold Warriors.
But I am not satisfied as an American to be second to the Soviet Union.
What we want to do is not to turn their way, but to do it our way. And that's exactly what we're talking about in this campaign.
Both men were Navy veterans. The candidates had been freshman congressmen together after the war. But somehow Kennedy seemed the younger and identified himself as the candidate of a new generation. The favorite candidate of much of the entertainment community reached the high point of his campaign in a series of debates on television.
These were the first presidential debates ever. There'd never been a presidential debate before.
Smith, Senator Kennedy.
And the fact that it was happening live and on television gave it a kind of theater that was remarkable.
The question now is, can freedom be maintained?
The candidates were close on the issues, particularly on a tough stand against the Soviet Union.
I, of course, disagree with Senator Kennedy.
Studies after the debate show that those who heard it on the radio thought Mr. Nixon had won. Those who saw it on television gave the edge to
Supply
Kennedy.
and demand into balance. Attempt
The
effective
image
production
that came
controls.
over
We
definitely
won't have that
favored
5 or
Kennedy.
6% surplus, which breaks the price.
To see his earnestness, to feel his charm, to feel his idealism, I'm convinced that he would not have won without the debates.
After the closest presidential election of the century, the country's oldest elected president at the time was succeeded by its youngest.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
It was very exhilarating in a sense to have a man as young and articulate and electric as John Kennedy was.
Whether it wishes us
What he said
well
was
or
quite
ill,
hawkish when you look back on
that
it.
we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
After the soaring words of the inaugural speech, the inaugural parties gave final proof to the notion that a younger and more glamorous administration had arrived.
I remember Lenny Bruce say, "Isn't it great to have a president who you can imagine sleeping with his wife?" And I thought at the time, God, I think that too. You could identify with the man in that sense. He had, it was the first president that seemed like a guy, not like something on a dollar bill.
The idea of a White House run and staffed by younger people, with a 32-year-old chief speechwriter and a press secretary in his 30s, and all these people around Kennedy, there was that feeling that, well, if they're running the political system, surely we can be somehow involved in it.
We wanted to serve. We wanted to do something because young people, me included, in those days, did wonder how we were ever going to top the generation before us. Our fathers had fought World War II. They had won. They had beaten a depression in some way. What are we going to do?
So basically, JFK is able to win this election with a very narrow victory over Richard Nixon. And a lot of people really thought Nixon was going to win because, both of these men were World War II heroes. They'd both been congressmen. They'd served in the Senate, at least JFK had. And they really and truly were the same age and, made great speeches. And the debate was very, very close. So it seemed like, it was going to be a very tough election. Was it going to be another Republican candidate who was going to win? Or was it going to switch to the Democrats? And a lot of people feel that it really went down to that debate. And that President Kennedy understood the power of television. And so he wore a suit that kind of contrasted and stood out from the background. He wore makeup so it didn't appear like he was like sweating under the lights. And he was able to look more young and vibrant and really appeal to the younger generation. And so he wins. And he promises that he is this candidate of a new generation. And it was pretty controversial. I mean, he is a young man. He's only 43 years old, which may not seem that young to you, but you can't even run for the presidency till 43. So he is replacing, at the time, Eisenhower was the oldest president. Our current president, President Biden, is the oldest president ever. And he's replacing, him with this young, vibrant, youngest president ever, who also is the only Irish Catholic president we've ever had. And at the time, that was kind of a big deal because people thought that somehow, if you were a Catholic president, that since, head of the Catholic Church is the Pope, that somehow the president would do whatever the Pope told him to do or something bizarre like that. So it was a controversial thing, at least at this point in history, when Americans were highly religious. Just so you can kind of look at the map, you can see that, Nixon being the Republican candidate, he wins kind of what is considered the typical Republican states, which usually kind of are in the middle of the country. Whereas Kennedy wins the typical what's considered the Democrat states, except a few differences. Like at this point, Kennedy wins Texas, where in this day and age, Texas usually goes Republican. And when you're looking at the map, you can see that Nixon won California because that's his home state. But in general, in today's world, California usually always goes Democrat. So a few differences back then compared to today as you're looking at the Electoral College map. But really, JFK won by a slim margin of only 120,000 popular votes. He wins with a small Electoral College, vote margin. And so when we say he wins without a mandate, it's not like the American people love him or think he is the best and the brightest or anything. And so he kind of has his work set out ahead of him to make Americans fall in love with him. And it's not going to be easy. His approval rating is always, it's not going to be very high, especially during the first year or two of his presidency. Now, even though he's going to struggle, especially, with his economic policies, for the most part, Americans are really fascinated by President Kennedy. And a lot of it, as they suggested in the video, has to do with the fact that you know, JFK came off as this regular guy with this happy family. Um, and it's interesting because JFK is not a regular guy at all. I mean, he went to Harvard, which is not normal. Only the best and the brightest go there, and people with tons of money. Um, he tries to seem like he has a very average life, like he did his, military service, yes, but he also was a war hero and won medals. And other people, served in the military and won medals, but he also was able to kind of put himself into more of a prestigious position because of his father, who had served in politics and had served abroad and knew World War II was kind of on the horizon. And, he had this family of money and power who'd served in politics. So they try to make him seem like he's average and normal and relatable, and has a family and a wife, and is just a regular guy. But at the same point, he's really not. Part of the fascination Americans had with him, though, was the fact that he had this wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, who was very beautiful, who was also very smart, and had gone to school herself and was from a very wealthy family. But they had these two young children, JFK Jr. and Caroline. And so people love watching, just pictures and home movies of them out on the White House lawn and the kids playing and just living a regular life. And I guess that's what captured the heart of the American people. And the president really did seem like this young, happy, energetic man who was ready to take on the world and be the new generation and be the voice of it, especially as people were demanding change, because the world did seem like it was changing. As we get to 1960, these are people who are, perhaps they were born during World War II, so they didn't serve in World War II. They're growing up in this post-war kind of world, and so maybe they were born, at the very beginning of the war or in 41, and they didn't serve, of course, by any means, and they just, think the future is bright ahead of them. And so he's trying to be this candidate, of this new generation, seeming all healthy and young, but he was anything but that. He actually suffered from this very debilitating disease called Addison's disease, and they really covered up his health issues. And as him and Jackie traveled abroad, and it was physically exhausting and demanding on them, he had this doctor that traveled with them who gave them all sorts of injections and medicine, and basically was like almost like a type of speed or meth, if you really had to kind of equate it to modern drugs, as far as what him and Jackie were taking to try to stay pumped up, almost on 20 energy drinks at a time, to try to meet all these people. Americans do become rather obsessed with Jackie and JFK and their family, and so they are considered normal, average, relatable people that Americans like, and he most likely could have gotten reelected, if it had ever come to that. But at the same time, they seemed, beautiful and mysterious and charming and different, and so they really considered themselves to be like royalty, and so they called themselves American royalty, and so the media especially kind of harps on this idea and refers to them as kind of like Camelot, like the idea of like King Arthur's court, and it's like a fairy tale kind of life, and all of this. And they're all about art and culture and educating people and improving America and really, creating a new world for this new generation of young people who perhaps were trying to prove to the world that Americans and capitalism was the best way of life. JFK's brother, the guy that you see in the picture, Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy, or also known as RFK, that is his best friend, his closest advisor. He's going to be part of the president's inner circle. And, the president's vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, he was pretty much put on the ticket because they wanted to balance the ticket. As much as JFK is young, LBJ is much older. And, JFK is quite the talker. LBJ kind of, so you've got JFK who's the car salesman, manipulative, charming, schmoozing. LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, is very much so, doesn't like to stand on ceremony, isn't sophisticated, is plain spoken. They were as different as night and day, and so they definitely chose him to balance the ticket, but he is not kind of one of the president's circle and on any of these policies. In fact, they had some kind of different views about how America should be run, really. The media starts to call the president's cabinet the best and the brightest because it is made up of, people from all walks of life who have different educational and economic backgrounds, who could help the president make decisions about how to best fight this Cold War. Should we have nuclear weapons? Should we build up our arsenal? Should we go ahead and nuke Russia? How do we stop this Cold War? And then there's problems at home as far as people are living in poverty, and people are not getting an education, and there's still unemployment. And America was on the verge of a recession at this point in 1960. And that's normal. We've talked this year about the economic cycle and how there's highs and lows. Well, you can't have, a 10-year period of highs, which it was during the 50s, where Americans are building and building and building and spending all this money and buying new cars and building businesses, and just the economy is booming and unemployment is low, especially as it continued to be low, from World War II. It's not going to be like that forever. Eventually, you're going to see a recession, a period of a slowdown. It's just kind of the normal period. And as we get to 1960, we're starting to see this slowdown. And part of it has to do with the fact that, sometimes that happens when you have a presidential election year. Americans were very fearful of the Soviet Union. Some of them were deciding to hold on to their money rather than spend it. Perhaps needing to build a bomb shelter or to protect their families. Maybe they shouldn't go on vacation. And so we're going to see that the economy is starting to slow down as people are starting to spend less. Well, that means that stores aren't selling as much, so people get laid off, and that leads to unemployment. So the president is really going to have to figure out, how do we try to help the economy and get it going again and give it a real boost? And so these advisors are going to be helping him do that. So the president, his domestic agenda, as far as what his plans are for America, he calls it the new frontier. And he says, if you vote for me, if you elect me, I'm going to work on not only trying to boost our economy and decrease unemployment, but I'm going to try to come out with programs to help the poor. I'm going to try to improve education. I'm going to try to fight communism abroad. And I'm going to be focusing on kind of this space program, because he really felt like Americans were falling behind, especially after Sputnik had been launched. And so there's going to be a bigger push to get kids in school, kids graduating high school, kids taking more math and science classes. We want to have Americans being able to compete with the rest of the world. We don't want to have the Russians, on the moon first. We don't want, guns somehow on the moon pointed at America, which sounds bizarre now, but people had real fears at this point in 1960. The president said, one of his most famous speeches, of course, is his inaugural address, where he says, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." And he's really pushing this new generation, of people who were born at the very beginning of World War II or after, people who are in their, mid to late teens or early 20s, saying, what are you going to do to make America a better place? What do you want for your children? What do you want for the future? We need to conquer problems. And one of the problems he is going to take on, of course, is discrimination and segregation in America. So he's going to be a big proponent of trying to, create integration in schools and such. That's already begun, after the Brown versus Board of Education court case in the Little Rock Nine, which we'll talk more about next week. But he's going to be a big proponent of that. But he says, what else can we do? And he says, we stand on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unfulfilled hopes and dreams, a frontier of unknown opportunities and beliefs in peril. Beyond that frontier are uncharted areas of science and space, unsolved problems of peace and war, unconquered problems of ignorance and prejudice, unanswered questions of poverty and surplus. So he's really pushing for people to help their country. And he says, are you going to do community service? Are you going to serve in the military? Are you going to open a business? What are you going to do to kind of give back? How are you going to pass it, pay it forward, so to speak? And so one of the things that he's really interested in is equal pay. And this is about equal pay. It doesn't matter if you're black or white or man or woman. So he is working towards, less racial discrimination and less gender discrimination. He wants to get Congress to pass an Equal Pay Act where he says, look, if you're a janitor and I'm a janitor, it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, if you're black or white, you should get basically the same pay for doing the same job. The idea of this federal discrimination needs to end. And so they're going to be ending it, at least in federal government positions, and then working to end it in private businesses as well. Otherwise, people will be facing, prosecution for that. So he's working towards those things. He's also, in terms of our economy, to try to get it up and going again. he's going to give tax cuts for the next 3 years to millions of companies. And the idea was that if they had to pay less taxes, that money then could be used to be passed on to their employees to increase their pay. And then those employees would go out shopping, and that would help stimulate the economy. So it's that more supply side economics, that trickle down effect, or they could hire more people. He also is encouraging a higher minimum wage because he says way too many Americans are living in poverty. And he is going to be pushing Congress to create government subsidized housing. So if people are living in poverty, so they can get more of a clean apartment building to be living in and raising their family. He's also going to be pushing for more benefits for Social Security to try to help the elderly because they hadn't received basically higher wages in terms of their benefits in years. And he says, the prices of goods go up over time because of inflation, because of increasing prices. A gallon of milk now is not what it was in the 1930s when Social Security was created. People are going to need more money to live on, even if it's a fixed income. He's also going to be creating the Peace Corps during this time period, where he's encouraging Americans to basically join this organization where they're going to be traveling to other countries. They're going to help people build homes, kind of almost like Habitat for Humanity. They're going to perhaps give out medicine to people in other countries, food, maybe education, supplies. The Peace Corps does a variety of jobs, but it was a way of kind of, creating jobs for young people who didn't know what they wanted to do with their life. They didn't maybe want to go into the military. They didn't want to get a job right away. They weren't sure if they wanted to go to college. They just didn't know what to do with themselves. So he said, how about you give back? We will pay you. You can travel the globe. You can meet new people. You can stop the spread of communism basically by improving our economy. You can help us create allies to spread world peace, and you can help these people to get better housing and food and medicine and education. He also is going to work on, water pollution. We're going to start to see more of an environmental push during this time period, and especially once LBJ comes into power. They're going to start to realize that there's pollution in America. You can't have all these years of creating these new factories without addressing the fact that the water is getting polluted, the air is getting polluted. So he's going to start working towards that. He really is interested in helping young people, trying to stop juvenile delinquency, trying to make sure that kids are getting a better education. And then he's, of course, going to be building up our stockpile of missiles in case we need to be prepared for a nuclear war. He's going to be producing nuclear power plants. And eventually he'll go on to create the first nuclear test ban treaty, where basically we have an agreement with Russia about testing nuclear weapons and using them. That'll come out in tomorrow's notes. He's also very interested, in trying to stop communism kind of in Central South America, because we're very fearful since, Eisenhower, while he was still in office, Cuba, which is only 80 miles off the coast of Florida, they had become communist. We were very concerned about that and their relationship with the Soviet Union. He wants to make sure no other countries in Central or South America become communist, so he gets Congress to pass this program called the Alliance for Progress. It's basically, in a very racist sense, I didn't say it, they did, they call it the Marshall Plan for brown people, where they're going to be giving billions of dollars to Central and South American countries to help them build roads and schools and educate people and give out medicine. And so these countries are less likely to fall to communism if they have a stable economy, just like what happened in Eastern Europe after World War II. Is it successful? Somewhat, yes, but a lot of the money ends up getting kind of misused by government officials in those countries who use it to kind of take vacations and live their own lavish lifestyles and not necessarily help the people. The Central Intelligence Agency, some of our spies actually getting involved in some of these countries to try to overthrow some of those leaders who misuse funds and take our money kind of when they shouldn't have. Many Americans, though, kind of how this ties into our domestic policy is that, they do get jobs as part of this Alliance for Progress program, kind of like the Peace Corps, and they go to these countries and kind of help them, build new roads or get an education. So they work as school teachers and such. Last thing to really talk about today, last two slides are to talk about the space race. And, when JFK comes into office, he basically, knows that America needs to up its game when it comes to, space travel, because the Russians, remember, had put the first satellite into space with Sputnik. And then that was in 57. So shortly after the Americans, we put our own, satellite into space. And they're putting animals into space, and we're putting animals into space. After Laika the dog, the first animal to go into space with no chance of survival, there are more attempts at trying to keep animals alive or get them back to Earth. But then things are going to change here. When cosmonaut, that's what they call the Russian astronauts, Yuri Gagarin will be the first to orbit the Earth. And we really start to worry that Americans are falling behind in the space race. And so we're going to put Alan Shepard into space as the first man in space. And that's when JFK makes his goal of putting the first man on the moon by the end of the decade. We're going to start to really see the creation of NASA, of the National Aeronautical Space Association. And eventually, JFK won't live to see it because he'll be assassinated November 22nd of 1963. But by July 20th of 1969, Americans will put the first man on the moon with Neil Armstrong when he takes one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
On April the 12th, 1961, the Soviets sent cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin into orbit around the globe.
The first Sputnik in 57, and then Yuri Gagarin going into space in 61, terrified the American people. People were sitting around and talking about what would we do if the Russians had arms, missiles, whatever, on the moon, and could shoot. We were making the stuff up, but shoot at us at will, and we'd have to surrender. Then we had to choose better red than dead. That's what people were thinking then.
In what would become a spiraling series of superpower moves and countermoves, just 3 weeks after the Soviets' manned launch, the U.S. sent astronaut Alan Shepard into space. And President Kennedy promised even greater heights.
We choose to go to the moon.
A man on the moon, walking on the moon? Now, in this decade?
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
You gotta be kidding. But Kennedy wasn't kidding.
Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
All right, guys, and that's it for today. Hopefully you're on track with all your assignments and working on your project. Let me know if you need any help. Have a great day, guys.